Good afternoon, everyone. This is the second webinar in hopefully a series of webinars being brought to you by the Zoning, Planning, and Land Use section of the North Carolina Bar Association. I'd like to recognize our former section council president, Teree Hagler Gray, because she brought together a group of interested attorneys to focus our efforts as a collective, as a group, to think about affordable housing. I think everyone in the state of North Carolina knows that affordable housing is an issue across the state. And I think we all know that housing is vitally important for people, regardless of whatever their income level is. So this is our second webinar in a series. We thought it would be good to have these webinars both to enhance the discussion around affordable housing, but also so that we all can be educated. And today's session, I know that the attorneys that organized it are especially looking forward to, because I think we're feeling like we're going to get some education in an area that we don't have a lot of experience with. So without further delay, I'll get to our webinar. One other note I wanted to make: if folks have questions for our speaker, please put those in a direct chat message to Teree Hagler Gray. You'll find Teree's name on the participant list, and Teree will vet questions and she will pose those to our speakers at the end of their presentation. Again, thanks a lot for participating. I see we're already up to 74 participants. That's really great. We're sharing some data just so that everyone can see these results, right? We're sharing some data as far as who is on the line. So we've got some developers, local government attorneys like myself. I'm an attorney with the city of Durham, some private practice attorneys, and then also members of our local government staff. I know I extended this invite to our planners here in the city of Durham. And so I think everyone knows the title of the presentation today, or our webinar, is Making It Make Sense, Understanding Affordable Housing Finance. And we are really fortunate to have two excellent speakers today. The first speaker that you'll hear from is Ben Stevens. Ben is a development manager for Zom Living, where he's involved in all aspects of the development process in the Carolinas. He also serves as Director of Development Standards, overseeing an implementation of design standards throughout the firm and with design partners. He's the author of a widely used college textbook entitled The Birth of a Building: From Conception to Delivery, and is a frequent speaker on topics related to real estate finance, including previously to the North Carolina Bar Association. And I also know that he was very well received at a recent North Carolina Planning Association meeting. At the request of the city of Raleigh, he is currently assisting with text changes to support affordable housing to support the affordability of housing in Raleigh. Ben holds an MBA with a focus on urban economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a bachelor's degree in German from Missouri State University. And I know that we'll all look forward to hearing from Ben. Our other speaker is a former colleague of mine here at the city of Durham. His name is Pat Young. Pat is currently the Director of Planning and Development for the city of Raleigh, and he's been in that position since July of 2020. Prior to joining the Raleigh Planning Office, Pat was with the city of Durham for 12 years. He was our assistant director, and at the end of his career with Durham, he was our planning director. In Durham, Pat led efforts to help promote housing accessibility and affordability through zoning reform and to make the development process more customer-oriented, timely, and predictable, and he is now leading similar efforts for the city of Raleigh. Pat is a proud member of the Urban Land Institute, the North Carolina chapter of the American Planning Association, and he's also a volunteer of Habitat for Humanity. And I know Pat also has 2 high school students in the Wake County Public Schools. And with that, I will turn it over to Ben Stevens, our first presenter.
Thanks so much, Don. Can you guys hear me all right? I'll just say I'm extremely flattered to be here, in particular speaking alongside Pat, who I've gotten to know and just really respect what he's doing at the department in Raleigh. So let me share my screen here. I'm going to be giving a modified version of the talk that I gave, as Don mentioned, at the planning conference. So let's see, share my screen here. And so making it make sense. This is a topic I have a lot of passion about. I've worked on the affordable side. I've renovated public housing. I've worked on the ultra luxury side. And so I try to bring the mindset of both of those things to bear. I think as we're all trying to strategize about this difficult problem. So as Don mentioned, if any of this is interesting, I recommend The Birth of Building. And I have a blog called theskylineforum.com where I talk about subjects related, the interdisciplinary development subjects, and love speaking on this topic. So I'll share some other resources in the chat. I want to start off my conversation about affordable housing in kind of a strange place. Last week I asked ChatGPT to generate an image of people who have a trust fund, and this is what it spit out. And I don't have a trust fund. I don't know if anybody does. I don't have a problem with one. I'd be happy to have one, but I don't. And I guess the point that I would make about trust funds is that whatever their pros or cons, they're not really the natural environment, right? Many of us are not born with this. And so we have to kind of economically fight and struggle and figure out how to make our income and our expenses work without any sort of outside assistance. And so I think it's very important in a group like this, especially as we're thinking about how do we use the precious public dollars that we have, which need to be used. How do we use those most wisely? I would submit to you that I think it's always best for everyone to start, whether you're on the subsidized or the unsubsidized side, understanding how things work on the market rate side so that you know how to leverage, every bit of the market's normal forces before you start, taking your precious public dollars and putting them in one way or the other. So I'm going to take that approach today. Along those lines, I would say there really is no such thing as affordable housing. There's housing that we choose to subsidize either with capital subsidies or with vouchers. And so, but to help you start thinking about that, I want to start with the basics of real estate finance in general. I'm not going to use this whole agenda today. We're really just going to focus on this part here called All the Finance You Need. And I've been told to start gradually, right? Not to go too deep. But I do want to make just a comment. I'd be remiss not to say something. I normally talk about supply and demand, and I want to just make a couple of notes on that before I move on. So I grew up playing a game called Sim City. I don't know if anybody on this call will have seen that game or played it before. One of the early computer games. And I'm sure Sim City is a difficult game, but I always found it really easy because my cousins told me about a cheat code called Budamus. And whenever you typed in Budamus, I don't know how I remember this, but whenever you typed in Budamus, $1 million would come into the city coffers and everyone cheered. So I would get the game going by typing Budamus, 5, 6, 7 times. And then all the public works, I wanted to do were on the table. But I imagine if I worked at the city or if I was a council for a city, I would find that there is no such cheat code, that there are all sorts of constraints that you operate under when you are trying to use public revenue in a prudent way and in a way that is going to be looked on favorably by the public. And those sorts of constraints are numerous in the world of development. So on the demand side, given the extraordinary risks that a developer like myself takes, given the risk that your banker or your people who manage your retirement fund take in giving me your money to do a development and not wanting to lose it, giving the constraints that we have to build what people can afford to pay, and the constraint that we have to find a landowner who's willing to sell us the land. It may be an area where people want development to happen, but no one's willing to sell. So normally I would do a deep dive into the different psychology of these people, but this is a lot of projects that want to happen die at this stage of these demand constraints. And then I don't think I have to tell anyone on the call about the constraints of working through a public process and trying to satisfy all the different stakeholders in the name of bringing supply to the market. I will note here that I am personally chatting with a number of people about some reforms that I think are no-brainers, save the city time and money, and also lead to some positive impacts on supply and demand, and just making the process more transparent. So I'll share those in the chat. But let me jump to the primary part of my talk now, all the finance you need. So let's do baby steps here. So I'm going to use kind of a gear shifting metaphor while we still know what combustion engines are. So the really very first idea in finance is the question, if I was to give Therese, if for every dollar that Therese gave me, I gave Therese $1.12, how many times would she want to make that trade? I assume the answer is going to be as many times as possible, because she's getting the dollar back and she's getting 12 cents on top of it, right? That's a return of your capital and a return on your capital. You could make $12 or 12,000 or 12 million, just depending on how many times you do the trade. And that's the essence of business, whether it's my daughter's lemonade stand or a commercial airliner. Conversely, if there's a project where we say, for every dollar Therese gives me, I give her 90 cents back, that's not going to work for long. No one's going to line up to give her that capital. And so I consider this process of creating value kind of like an artistic constraint of development. We can do more than that. We can have public art. We can have a beautiful facade, but we have to create value first. Okay, so at the risk of being pedantic, that's the very first idea. So this next idea here of finance is what I call the central riddle of real estate finance, and I'd be super fascinated if anybody wants to respond. I'm sure someone on the call knows, but the riddle goes like this. Imagine that there are two perfectly identical buildings built by the same construction firm in the same city, designed by the same architect, using materials from the same suppliers. They somehow paradoxically have the same views of the city. They're physically identical in every respect. But a real estate appraiser tells you that 469, McDowell here, is worth significantly more than 459. How is that possible? How is it possible that two physically identical buildings are worth, a materially different amount? And if this was we were in a room with a crowd, I would ask for answers. But the answer is that, let's say that these buildings opened. Let's say it's student housing. Student housing is very acute with your dates. If you open the wrong month, you lose all your leases. So let's say that this building 469 here opened, at the right time, and it got all the leases, and 459 opened a month too late, and so the rents are much lower. If this building is offering $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year more in rent, entirely independent of the fact that it's physically identical, you are going to be willing to pay more for it. And so in the final analysis, it's not the physical structure that creates the value in a building. It is the income it creates. And they may be corresponding, and you may be able to increase the income by making it nicer, but that's only to a point, right? There might be a house that you like more than the one you have now, and you might pay more, but it hits a point, right? It hits a point of diminishing returns. And so you probably will not be surprised to learn that the single most important metric in real estate finance for a developer, for a market rate developer, I should say, is what I call the income to cost. You might hear people talk about the yield on cost, which I find to be an obscure term. But if you think about the ratio of what income is this building generating and what does it cost to develop, it's only in comparing those two things that you could know if you have a viable deal. I have a happy hour called Developer Group Therapy, and all the developers in Raleigh come. And if someone comes to this group and says they have a new deal, the very first question everyone asks is, what's the yield? Which is to say, what is the ratio of income to cost? It has nothing to do with your financing or your timeline. It can't lie. How much money does the building make, in rent checks, and how much does it cost? Okay. So if I'll just tell you, a year ago, if you were looking at a project that had a capital budget of $100 million, and we would probably have been getting about 5.75 million of income, which is to say it would have had a 5.75% income to cost. Now, that is what a developer thinks about. That's the absolute heart of real estate finance for a developer. What is the relationship between the income to cost? And you'll understand why that's so important in a minute. But now if you imagine that you aren't developing, you're buying a property. Paul is going to go buy a property, and the seller of the house says, well, or Lacera, is going to go buy a house. And the seller says, well, this house cost me X to build. Lacera doesn't care how much it costs to build. There's a value that she attributes to the building. And so when we go to sell a building, or more to the point, when I go to a bank and I say, how much financing can I get for this building? They're going to say, well, let's look at the income and let's look at what return people in the market require when they buy a building. So let's say that I keep the income the same, it's 5.75 million, but let's say that based on returns in the market, that someone's willing to take a lower return because it's an existing building. Let's say they're willing to take 4.5%. Well, I simply say, what's a number for which this income, 5.75 million, is 4.5%? And to do that, I simply take this number and divide it by this one. And so the banker says, oh, your building's worth $127 million. So 127 is more than 100 million. Ben keeps his job. This is a viable transaction. But if the rate of return that an investor requires goes up significantly, then the story changes, and I could be in a position where I'm losing money. Again, if someone is only thinking about how do subsidies work, they're saying these are niceties I don't maybe have to concern myself with as much. And so that's why I want to open up Excel real quick and show you a few scenarios that I think will bring to life how this income to cost relationship works. I'm looking at my time. All right, so let's see here. And please do interrupt me with questions if you have them. Okay, so we have an architecturally significant 5-story building here in my Excel model. And so let's start thinking about some numbers as you guys might be experiencing them. And this will, I think, be helpful as you try to understand what's happening with the market right now. So there is in every market what's called a risk-free rate. You can go lend money to the government, and as long as they don't default, you're going to get that money back. So that is what we call the risk-free rate. So let's say that it's 3%. Well, if you are going to go buy a building, if Don O'Toole is going to go buy a building, a lot of things can happen to a building that can't happen to a 10-year treasury. So Don O'Toole says, I need a higher return if I'm going to do that. So let's say he needs a 4.5%, income to value ratio, which for all you math sleuths is actually 50% more than 3%, right, on relative basis. And I, as a developer who am putting out $2 million in cash to do my project before I have any investment in the project, I, as a developer, I need an even higher return. So let's say that I'm going to ask for a 5.75%. Well, let me come here to my budget. I have a $100 million project, and that's a trillion. That's too much. 100 million. And so we're saying that I'm going to have an income of 5.75%. I hope you're all still following. Well, the person who goes to buy this building is also going to have that income, but now they're going to value it at the rate which is more than the risk-free rate, but less than what I'm getting. And so when I do this math real quick, as you'll see, I'm getting an increase of about 27%. That's my margin of safety, so to speak. Well, what happens if Jerome Powell, in his infinite wisdom, sees that the macroeconomic conditions are not what they ought to be for the health of the economy overall, and decides that the risk-free rate needs to go to 4%? Well, now my investor is going to say that their rate goes to 5.25%, for example. Well, now nothing has happened about the income or the rents that I'm generating. Nothing has happened about the construction costs, but because of factors in the macro economy, the risk-free rate goes up. And so what an investor requires goes up. And unless I can somehow drastically increase my rents or drastically reduce the construction cost, I'm not able to get to a value that my investors say we feel comfortable with. There's incredible uncertainty in development. I might lose $200,000 in pursuit costs because the project simply doesn't get approved or doesn't move forward. And so I have to have a little bit of extra cushion on other projects so that I don't go belly up. So that's what happens when the risk-free rate rises. But let's think about what happens in some more traditional land use scenarios. So let's say that we have our building here, and we don't just have to look at this in terms of 5.75 million. We can break this income up. So let's say I come to this income number here, and I say, but there's 5 floors. So each floor is responsible for 1.15 million of this income. Tari, Paul, you think people are tracking with me here? I know we're on mute, but this going okay so far? Anybody any questions coming in? I know we're clipping along.
No questions so far.
Okay, I'll take that as a sign that it's totally lucid and what's the legal word? Conspicuous. All right, so 1.15 million, and I'm going to divide this by what the investor says that this is worth. Let's go back to our original number here. So this floor is worth $25.5 million, and of course, when I sum these up, I'm gonna get to my my original number. Well, what happens if I get to the planning board and they say, Ben, we love this building. It's everything that we want. It's just too damn tall. Can we talk about reducing the height? So mathematically, that's a pretty straightforward thing to do, right? I'm just going to delete this row. I'm just going to take off the income here. And okay, so nominally, I've reduced it by 1.15 million. I've reduced the value by 25 million, but Crimea River, you don't have to build the 5th floor. Well, let's think about kind of how that works. We have some attorneys on the phone. What happens when I have a PSA and planning commission says, you can't go to the 5 stories, and I go back to the landowner and say, I'm sorry, I need to renegotiate my land contract because circumstances, in the entitlement front have changed. They're going to be very unlikely to renegotiate the PSA. So my land cost is not going to change. If I come back to my attorneys or to my architects and say, hey, there's a change of plans, I have to reduce this by a floor, is there a universe in which their fees go down? No, of course they go up, because in fairness to them, the architect has to redraw things. The structural engineer has to redo calculations. My attorney has to refile motions or have new meetings and modify agreements. So the land cost stays the same. My soft costs go up. And as we're thinking about hard costs, what happens to hard costs when I kill a floor? Well, I'm going to save money on the actual materials on the 5th floor, but I'm still going to get Duke Energy out there and pull utilities to the site. I'm still going to put a construction trailer up. I'm still going to have a superintendent and 25 different subcontractors. I'm still going to have all the overhead costs that come along with having a major commercial construction project. And so if I lose 20% of the building's value, but I'm only able to recoup about 8% of the costs, that doesn't necessarily damn the project, but it certainly moves me in the direction of a project not penciling or not being feasible. Again, it's not that you often encounter a project which will make $0, but you encounter a project for which you say, can I go get people to give me their money to put at risk, in particular my own dollars, spend $1 million or $2 million to get this project to closing with the hope of making a 6 or 7% return. Most people are not interested in that sort of risk reward transaction. And so that's how a project becomes unfeasible. And as a last scenario here, I just would like to talk for a moment about inclusionary zoning, because I know that is a hot button issue right now. So in inclusionary zoning, what we're simply doing is we're saying, let's take this top floor, and instead of deleting it, let's put this floor or a distributed number of units equivalent to one floor at 60% AMI or 80% AMI, let's call it 70%. So nominally, I have reduced the income by, $300,000, $350,000. And the value certainly looks very similar. But if you come down here, what I've done is I've said, all right, in my original transaction, let's say I was going to give 70% of the profit to an investor because they put in the overwhelming majority of the funds. And I'm going to take 30%. And in the original transaction, after 5 years of work, I was going to get $8 million and they were going to get 19. Well, when I come in here and I say, okay, I'm going to do inclusionary zoning on 20% of the units, what happens is the losses to the value of the building are about 7.6 million. And if I attribute that to the loss to the investor and the developer, it's reducing their profit by about 30%, and it's reducing my profit by about 30%. And this is assuming, and that's really the enormous assumption. Yes, I'm happy to share a copy of the sheet. In fact, let me, yeah, I have links to a number of things. So this is making the extraordinary assumption that the only headwind that this project might be facing financially is from inclusionary zoning. For example, let's imagine that the scenario happens that we were looking at above, where the risk-free rate starts rising. Now, let's see, what is it at right now? Right now, the risk-free rate as of today is at like 4.1%, right? So if I'm still at 5.75%, or let's say what's more realistic right now, about 6.1%, between the market moving, and I think hopefully we understand the math on that now, and inclusionary zoning, I've reduced my profit by about 73%. I'm sure many of you are in conversations with developers who are saying we need additional funds for our affordable project. This is why. The combination of these different things can simply move a project toward, me spending $2 million with the prospect of perhaps earning 700,000. And at that point, you decide that a project is not feasible. So to finally come to the point, thank you for your patience. Let's talk about affordable housing finance. So in a normal market transaction, when I create a financial model, I'm going to do it in one of a couple of ways. The most traditional is I'm going to say, well, here's how much income I can hope to earn, and here's the cost, and I'm just going to compare them, right? Income to cost. I can also do it a bit algebraically. I can say, I know what the income will be, and I know how much I want to make, so tell me what I can afford to spend. Or the most dangerous version, I think I know what it's going to cost and how much I want to make. Tell me how much the rents have to be. This is the thing I have the least control over, right? But in a subsidized housing transaction, we're not doing that at all. So if I go to Novogradac or some similar organization, or just go straight to NCHFA and say, what are the rents that I can ask for at the 60% AMI or the 80% AMI? I'm going to create a simple table of how much revenue I can collect. And I'm going to have a table that calculates my expenses, and I'm going to have a budget. These are believable numbers for right now. And the income to cost ratio on this, at a time when the prime interest rate is 8.5, the income to cost in an affordable deal, in this affordable deal, is about 2.88%. So for every, I haven't calculated the math, but as I'm sure you can imagine, if you get 2.88 and you owe 8.5, those aren't good numbers. So here is how affordable housing finance works. You go to a senior lender and you say, Karen or Bob, as the case may be, I have this project where my effective revenue is 2.238 million. And my net income is 1.18. And they say, well, we want to make sure that you can pay this loan and you have a cushion. So your maximum annual payment is going to be, a certain subset of this number. Let's say it's going to be 990,000. Okay, well, I'm just going to tell you how big a loan I can give you for a payment of $990,000. It turns out that loan today would be 14 million. Now that would be fine, except for the fact that my project costs 41. So I'm by no means fully funded at that point. So then I go to the state and I say, I have a gap. I need additional funding because the income this project is generating isn't enough to get a big loan. What can you do for me? Well, they say, not all of your costs in this budget are eligible, but some of them are, the hard costs and some of the soft costs. So these are your eligible costs. Let me zoom in again a little bit for you. Sorry for not doing that sooner. And with some fancy footwork and calculations, we say you're technically eligible for this amount of tax credits, this allocation of credits that the federal government will give you, which you can then sell to investors to offset their tax liabilities. But because the NCHFA and all other housing finance agencies have a strong desire to not have all the funds go to one developer, they set a cap on that. So what I've done is I've said, okay, what's the maximum allocation I could get? I could get 2 million in tax credits per year times 10. So the max I could get is 20 million. So that's 49% of my budget. If I put the loan I can get, which is 14 million, and then I put the tax credits I can get, which are 20, I'm at $34 million for a $41 million project. In other words, I have a $7 million gap. This is the point at which I imagine many of you have gotten phone calls to say that project which the city loves is $7 million short. This is why. The revenue is what it is, and the budget is what it is, and it's not sufficient to get enough loan proceeds and enough equity proceeds to construct it. And so you're looking at different things you can do. You can go to the Federal Home Loan Bank and get $500,000. You can get a tax abatement perhaps that has a value of $1 million. And each of these things start lowering the overall gap that you have. But I will tell you that the experience that many of us have had as we do this sort of gap filling exercise is kind of like if you have a person who has many different medications they're taking, and those medications start interacting with each other, and it becomes difficult to say like what's creating the problem. Every person who's giving funds for perfectly justifiable reasons has stakeholders, and they have a mission, and they want to accomplish that mission via your project, and they want to show that your project exemplifies what they set out to do when they offer these funds. And it is not infrequently that some of those goals are at cross purposes, or at least are not especially easy to negotiate. And the number of consultants, accountants, and counsel who are involved in the project increases exponentially. I renovated 65 public housing units. There were 27 people on the closing call. And so obviously, as you increase the sources, it becomes very important. So I've used more than my fair share of the time, but I think that there are tremendous opportunities as people who have the influence that this crowd does. As you understand the dynamics of market rate finance, you understand the options that are available to us in affordable to find ways to be extremely resourceful with the public dollars we have. And I want to mention one bug I'll put in your ear before I hand it over to Pat to start talking about this is all theory. Pat's been doing the real stuff. So he'll share with you about that. But I want to share put one bug in your ear, and I'd be very interested to get your input. I had a project get turned down recently in spite of what I thought was pretty clear guidance in the comp plan. And I've licked my wounds, but the project would have involved building about 250 apartments. It would have generated about $600,000 a year in annual taxes. And apparently the city was not hurting for that money because they've left the land, at a virtually zero tax basis. But there's an alternate universe in which they allowed my project, and they had that tax increment come in. In that alternate universe, they could have said, we don't actually need this money, apparently. Why don't we keep the revenue at zero or at something, something less than the full $600,000? Use those funds to fund or capitalize a local voucher program that we have control over in a way that, we wouldn't over HUD vouchers. With $600,000 from my project, assume $700 a month in monthly voucher payments to residents. That project, my market rate project, which would have created housing and supply and had downward pressure all for its own reasons, could also have created dozens of vouchers that could have been used in a surgical way by that municipality without the recourse to other groups. There are concerns about getting the voucher uptake higher. There are solutions to those problems, and I'm not going to take any more of your time discussing them. But whether it's in using capital subsidies that we have available to us, or gap financing, or bond financing that we locally set up, or something like this, which I would say is a market rate solution to creating demand side subsidies, there are lots of tools on the table to use. And I think, commend you guys for joining a session like this to hear about it, because usually when I'm in a situation and it seems like there's only one lever, there are in fact 4 or 5. And to the extent that you are able to use them all, then the ask that any one person is going to be asked to fill is going to be a lot less. I just attempted to send a chat to the group with a number of different things. So my contact info, a link to a few different talks I've done that drill down a bit deeper on this, and I'm happy to send to Therese for her distribution, these 2 worksheets that I've shared. But really flattered by this time. Sorry I took so much of it, and I'm excited to hear what Pat has to say.
Thank you, Ben. And yes, thank you. We had the question about whether you would be willing to share your information. I think that what just happened is like you were a professor in kind of a difficult course, and we need to study the materials a little bit. So if you could just make sure we have those the presentations so that we can study them on our own.
Absolutely.
Email them to the group. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me and see my presentation?
Yes, Pat.
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Ben is a tough act to follow. He does incredible work and is really a go-to resource. And I'm grateful to him for participating and for sharing his information with you all, because we rely on him a lot to help understand some of the fundamental market dynamics of development here in Raleigh. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about what Raleigh and Durham have done. As you heard from Don, I have been 3.5 years here in Raleigh and was 12 years in Durham. I spoke with Sarah Young, who's my colleague, erstwhile co-worker and colleague, who's planning director in Durham, to get some of this material. I want to thank her. And Bo Dubrensky, my friend from Durham, is on the line and can answer questions about Durham's experience. But really, everything we're going to talk about today, I think, applies to any growing area in North Carolina. So I just want to talk a little bit about examples of what we've done around affordable housing and kind of what's next in terms of municipal approach to the housing affordability crisis. As I said, really every North Carolina metro that is growing has a housing affordability crisis. In Wake County, 26% of households are cost burdened. And then what that means is they're spending over 30% of their income on housing. That's 45% for renters and 16% for homeowners. Wake County has a higher than average income for North Carolina, and so those numbers are much higher in other metros. I'll also mention, before I go any further, I am not an attorney, 28-year planner, 24 here in North Carolina. But I will start off by saying something kind of obvious that you all well know. Hold on a second, let me see. Are you seeing the new slide? I'm sorry, I'm having a... Great. As you all well know, North Carolina does not have any authority for mandatory inclusionary housing or inclusionary zoning, rent control, or any broad authority on impact fees. There are, of course, some limited local authorities from the 1980s. And so that really creates a more limited toolbox than some other states have. The way I frame it and discuss it is that the only really 2 paths, and there are within these 2 paths, there are many other trails and tracks, as Ben alluded to, but is supply and subsidy, right? Supply to ensure that the local housing market is meeting the increasing demand, and subsidy to make sure the gaps in financing that Ben so well articulated can be met and that affordable housing can be built. So as you heard from Ben, but I think it bears repeating, almost every affordable housing project requires subsidy of some kind. The cost of land, finance costs, material, and labor, particularly land in our metro areas, make it really impossible. There are a few exceptions. Habitat for Humanity does some amazing work with discounted materials and volunteer labor, but the vast majority of housing requires a subsidy if it's going to be permanently affordable. The city of Raleigh and Durham both dedicate significant resources to subsidy and we're really proud to be, I'll speak for Durham here. Of course, I speak for Raleigh directly, really proud to be regional and I think national leaders on trying to make commitment of local funds to the subsidy to support the tax credit projects that you heard Ben describe. Most of our program, we passed an $80 million bond program here in Raleigh. Durham did a $90 or $95 million bond program a year or two before that. We have about $8 million a year in federal money here in Raleigh, and we have a penny on our tax rate, which is about $8 million. So cumulatively, one of the things we do is the main thing we do to help get affordable housing production is to help fill that gap that you saw Ben describe in these low-income housing tax credit or LIHTC projects. Despite the value of the tax credit, which is significant, there's always a gap. And particularly as you move into more desirable locations with higher land costs. And particularly if you're trying to get anything other than surface parked, if you want to add an elevator or parking garage, that gap grows significantly. And so the need for that local gap financing is crucial. And in Raleigh, we produced about 2,800 units in the last 5 years. I have a goal to produce about that many in the next 5 years. So that's about 5,600 units in 10 years. And again, I think something that we're really proud of. Those are permanently affordable, or at least through the term of the tax credit project. So, but as we got into this work several years ago, we discovered that 92%, I think that's very comparable for most of your jurisdictions on the call, 92% of all housing in Raleigh is market-based only, right? We've got about 8% that's owned by a housing authority that has federal, state, or local subsidies, that has a nonprofit or philanthropic group that's keeping it permanently affordable. So in the face of 92% of all housing units being market units, the prior council here in Raleigh really felt like there needed to be some focus on trying to increase supply of housing to keep up with demand. And one of the ways they did that for the economic reasons that you heard about from Ben, there was also a real interest and need to look for housing types that met folks at all points in the income spectrum and all points in their life cycle. About 70% of our residentially zoned land was dedicated to single family only housing. I want to be real clear that there is nothing wrong at all with single family housing. It's the backbone of our housing stock here in Raleigh and across North Carolina, but it is becoming increasingly economically inaccessible for more and more of our residents. And so to find a diversity of housing types will allow our communities to be diverse and to have folks at all points in the income and age spectrum available to live in our city. So that was just part of the purpose and need, but fundamentally it is to some extent about economics too, right? Having more housing units to compete for is better than having less. It doesn't make housing affordable. I want to be real clear on that, but it does reduce the price pressure, the upward price pressure. And by sharing walls, roofs, and infrastructure, the vast majority of townhouse or multifamily projects are more affordable. 10 to 20% is the average because of those shared components. So in Raleigh, over 5-year period.
Pat, can I just interrupt you? I just want to make sure you've got your presentation in the correct mode. We can see
your notes.
the next slide, but you might want to put in presenter mode.
Okay. Let me hold on a second. I did just advance the slide though.
Yeah, it's fine. We can just see your notes. That's fine.
It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to do that. I'm sorry. If you all can see the slides, I'm just going to proceed if that's all right. So you can see,
yeah, we can see it.
Great. So the over a course of 5 years, the Raleigh City Council passed a number of changes to our Unified Development Ordinance, which is of course our rule book for development, to allow a lot of changes that allowed a lot more housing in a lot more places and approvable administratively, right? Without having to go through a quasi-judicial process like the Board of Adjustment or through a rezoning. And there's a list on the screen here that talks about those different changes. I certainly won't go into detail there, but that certainly was a centerpiece of our affordable housing strategy to allow more homes in more places of different types. We've had significant uptake here. As best we can tell from our research, it's one of the highest in the country. We've had over 1,700 units, including 215 accessory dwelling units approved under these provisions since 2020. So That's about 25% of our all permits issued. So we really think that's going to make a dent. Again, these types of provisions will not by themselves by any means create affordable housing. As you saw from Ben, new housing is the most expensive type, but it does allow a more competitive housing market and helps manage costs, and is kind of a foundational and fundamental part of a affordable housing strategy. And Durham adopted a very similar set of changes in 2019, and then just last week or 2 weeks ago. So moving another source of subsidy, of course, can be through bonuses or incentives. As you all well know, there's no authority for mandatory inclusionary housing, but we can create bonuses through the ordinance. We have had both in Durham and Raleigh density bonuses, which allowed more housing density in exchange for affordability since the 1980s. Those were very, very little used. I don't think they were used at all until the last few years. And again, that all comes down to the economics that you heard Ben describe so well. What we've done here recently in Raleigh is passed, Raleigh Council passed something called the frequent transit overlay, the frequent transit development option. I get the wrong terms on the, it's not an overlay district. It's a administrative option that allows for greater density within a half mile of our frequent transit bus network and our planned bus rapid transit network. And we have had about a year and a half that's been in place. We've had 61 units. They're not all on the ground, but they all have gone through the entitlement process. And what that requires is over 12 units, 20% of the units have to be affordable to folks at 60% AMI for 30 years. So as you saw from Ben's model, it all depends on the economics of each project. Land prices vary from street to street, and calibrating these incentives is really, really hard. But it's something that is authorized, and that we think if we can continue to calibrate, can be a real source of essentially the market responding to incentives and producing more affordable housing than they otherwise would. Another tool that's been less frequently used, but I think it's got some promise, is statutory development agreements. This is one from Durham that there was a developer who, and I was working in Durham at the time, so this is how I know this, was highly motivated to give back, wanted to really do something for the community. He grew up poor. So again, the point is, this is something that he essentially brought this deal to the city. Is not something that could be exacted, but through a development agreement, and Don O'Toole worked on this, there was a 2-acre portion of a much larger market-based project off of Farrington Road, known as Arcadia, in Durham, but near Chapel Hill over Southwest Durham. That 2-acre property was donated by Beacon Development through a development agreement to a nonprofit builder. If the nonprofit builder didn't perform, it would go to the city. But that nonprofit developer has performed. It's under construction now. It's 82 tax credit units. So that the land being donated was a significant source of subsidy and in a really high need location. And so that, again, is something that, as I understand it, certainly all the experts are on this call, we have authority to pursue, as long as it's voluntary on everybody's part. We also have had a number of conditions voluntarily offered through conditional use zoning. Durham, of course, has a unique local bill, but it operates substantially like conditional use zoning in the sense that these have to be strictly voluntarily offered provisions through the zoning process. You see the list here of the types of conditions that were offered. Raleigh has had a much smaller amount of these. We've less than 100 units have either been financed or produced through these types of provisions, which is kind of a low single digits percentage of our overall affordable housing production and need here. But there have been a diversity of tools, including tenant relocation assistance, tenant notice, that were voluntarily provided without any local government reciprocity. So that's why a development agreement wasn't required. These are some recent examples from Durham that my colleagues in Durham shared with me just to show the scale. Durham's been had more uptake and success in this space with 1,100 units proffered since 2020. Again, well under 100 here in Raleigh, but you see that some of these are all recent projects from the last year or two. I think what that probably should suggest to you, exactly as Ben's presentation did, I hope, is that really depends on the individual project and their ability to absorb this internal subsidy and to still do the project. So many of these 1,100 units have not been produced. Very, very few have been produced, but they've been proffered through the zoning process. So where do we go from here is kind of my last slide. Then we'll turn it over to you all for any questions you have of Ben or I. As a practicing planner, it's really challenging with the lack of authority in North Carolina to manage this through the zoning process. I think we really would advocate as planners for more predictability. My colleague Mitchell Silver, who many of you may know, former Raleigh planning director, talks about a plan-based city versus a deal-based city. We would really like to encourage more clarity and predictability, because the outcomes we're getting from the essentially what amounts to a negotiation process are certainly inconsistent, and they're not always they're not really sufficient in meeting the need. In fact, there's been studies and evidence that shows that the communities that have more restrictive zoning codes and that use that zoning process to try to negotiate this have higher housing costs significantly in many cases where there's high demand. So having non-discretionary administrative approaches to allow more housing in more places over the middle and long term is clearly better in terms of housing abundance, creating more housing. Certainly clear authority from the General Assembly for some set of tools around affordable housing would create greater clarity for all parties. It's very rare for elected officials to be knowledgeable of the PSA, purchase and sale agreement, or the pro forma, which is the financial model that Ben showed you. And so it makes it really hard for them to negotiate in good faith, right? Or discuss, negotiate's the wrong term because it has to be voluntary. But all parties have limited information. And so we have other states that have clear authority in this space, impact fees, inclusionary zoning provisions. In those other states, what we see is that the cost of those provisions can be baked into the land and distributed more equally. Whereas here, it's much harder to do that, since a project could either require or not require, based on the voluntarily offered provisions, affordable housing. And so we think focusing continually on subsidy, which is the bond program, the federal program, and our local tax contributions, working with low-income tax credit developers is kind of our bread and butter, but looking for new partnerships through statutory development agreements or other tools, and then really continuing to refine and improve our zoning bonus program. So with that, I'll stop sharing. Sorry for the technical difficulties and not getting the right view there. I hope everybody was able to see that. I'll share my slides with Tree.
No problem. No problem at all. So thank you, Pat. Thank you, Ben, for sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. And we do have a couple of questions. While you were talking, Ben, a question came in about if you can clarify who establishes the risk-free rate.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a bit technical, but the Federal Reserve establishes the risk-free rate. When it says they raise rates, what they're raising is the secure overnight funding rate. That's the rate that if I am a bank, I can go borrow money from the secure overnight lending window. This is way beyond me. I need somebody in banking law to explain it all. But that's a rate that the Federal Reserve sets for its lending to member banks of the FDIC. What we actually call the risk, I can't go to the secure overnight lending window and get a car loan. So what actually counts as the risk-free rate is the 10-year treasury. The government sells 10-year treasuries, and that is something that I can go out and buy that often tracks with the secure overnight funding rate, but not always exactly, because people are saying, well, we think that rates are going to go down, or we think they're going to go up. So the 10-year Treasury is set by the market, and it's set by people guessing about what the economy is going to do. So hopefully that's a short but coherent answer.
Okay. And just to follow up, since you're already discussing that, there's a follow-up question about the market rate voucher proposal, if that would work in municipalities that don't need the additional tax revenue.
How it would work. So this is something I'm very personally interested in, and I'm floating it in this group for about the third time ever. But as I've been thinking about my experience in the capital subsidy side, on the voucher side, I think you're able to be a little bit more surgical, and because it goes with the tenant. So the idea is that vouchers are not as easy to get placed as we would like them to be, and that's for a few reasons I've learned. One is that the inspections can be rather onerous for the landlord to be accept a voucher. It can come with a waiting list with people who perhaps are ex-cons or something, and landlords don't want to not know who the tenant's going to be. And the eviction restrictions are also significantly more. There's a higher bar to evict somebody. So if you're a landlord and you're saying I have two tenants who will pay the same, all things being equal, you have more flexibility with the one who doesn't have a HUD voucher. And the idea here would be to all of those programs started with the right spirit, but over time have become governed by manuals that are thousands of pages long. And so in terms of income verification, in terms of assessing if a unit is safe and tenantable, there are just much easier ways to do that now that can kind of work in the background. My personal idea is that a municipality contributes money to a nonprofit. The renter contributes their portion of the rent to the nonprofit. The nonprofit pays the rent, with a guarantee to the landlord that this person is not going to meet your income requirements, but they are backed by this nonprofit. We're not the government. We will inspect their unit, but we keep track of their income. Housing authorities have to have half a dozen people on staff just to check incomes, just to work with landlords to make sure they're not out of compliance, to do tons of inspections. And the spirit of all those things is great, but they can have the adverse side effect of having landlords just not want to take the vouchers. And so I think that there are nonprofit ways that cities could work with nonprofits to and another thing that happens is many of the cities that are the most restrictive on zoning are very affluent places. Aspen, Colorado has an absolute housing crisis, and they also have a lot of wealthy people who want many, many services. Well, that doesn't really work. If no one can, have a job in your city, then your desire to have all these services is going to be frustrated. And vouchers are something that allow a city to be very surgical and saying, we feel like there's an absolute demand for 150 people to live in this part of the city. So that's something that I'm still very much vetting out. So don't hear me saying that it's an open and shut case on exactly how you thread the needle legally, but it's something I'm very seriously researching, and in particular, empirically, I'm trying to find folks who have been turned down for vouchers, who would take a letter of the sort that the nonprofit would use and go out and test, like, well, would I get approved with this letter when I wasn't getting approved with a housing choice voucher? That's something I'm looking at. I won't take any more time with it, but if that's of any interest to you at all, please email me. Love to talk.
Okay, thanks. And the next questions, well, maybe Pat, maybe you can answer this. Don had to leave for another meeting, but as you can see in the chat, there's a question about a specific policy that Durham may have about forgiving, releasing demolition liens for properties being developed for affordable housing. Do you know anything about that, Pat?
Yeah, I don't, and my colleague Bo Dobrynski's on the call, and if he can take that question. I can say in Raleigh, we've talked about that. We have not done that. We have very, very few. What's being referred to here is when a home falls into disrepair, the city has to do the demolition and attaches a lien that it can be waived for if affordable housing is redeveloped there. Great idea, great program. We have very, very little very few of our minimum housing cases advance to the point where we have to do that kind of demo. So I'm not sure that would scale much, and it's something we've looked at and we continue to look at, and I think it's got a lot of merit. Bo, can you speak to what Durham's doing?
Unfortunately, I can't speak to it. I've only heard that as a possible solution, so I'm not even sure if that's been fruitful yet. But I've only heard it from because it's work that other departments are doing within the city.
Okay. All right, so the next question has to do with density bonuses. Would either one of you like to talk about how those can be used effectively?
Yeah, I'll be glad to start, and then I'd love to hear Ben's thoughts on this. I think, just speaking from my personal experience, politically, it's the most attractive tool, right? Because what it does is allow zoning to remain really restrictive, except for where affordable housing is provided, and in those instances, density can be increased. As I mentioned earlier when I was speaking, calibrating how to set that incentive in a way that works at anything other than negligible uptake is really, really challenging. We did have a local firm with specialization in development economics do a study for us as we were calibrating that FTDO incentive that I talked about with the 20% over 12 units. And that seems to have been at least somewhat successful. The risk of that approach is that developers are strongly incentivized, as you heard from Ben, I think, to do what's allowable to do by right without having to go through any programs or assessments or evaluations, like documenting affordability for 30 years, for example. And so the risk is that you get suboptimally low density and people trying to avoid, they'll just do as much as they can under the by right as to right administrative approach. And so I think the approach we've taken in Raleigh that kind of did a shallow but broad kind of upzoning or zoning modifications to allow more housing types in more places, while finding carefully calibrated pieces to use the density bonus to enhance that, we think is going to have the biggest impact and uptake. But I would strongly, if your community is going to look at that, I would strongly encourage you to hire, and I'm happy to share. I'll put my contact information in the chat. Please feel free to reach out. I strongly encourage you to hire a firm that can really do a sufficient assessment to make sure you're calibrating that bonus amount in a way that can be used. Ben, you want to add to that?
Absolutely. And so it's cross-cultural exercise because I don't have the constraints that a lot of people in this call do. So obviously I'm not a huge fan of density bonuses, but two things. I mean, I think where they work is somewhat dependent on where you are. I mean, so in Palo Alto, where no housing has been built and you basically could not build enough, the demand is insatiable, or at least it was. Maybe people are leaving now, but in places like that, any sort of approval of any sort of project can absorb a lot because their rents are going to be astronomical, right? If you move toward a community where the supply has kind of flowed more freely, the margins that a developer are going to be getting are going to be necessarily lower, and so the ability of a project to absorb. And I think Pat's absolutely right. To the extent you do that. I haven't dug into it, but I believe the state bill in Florida does some sort of in return for affordable units, there's some sort of a predictable tax abatement. I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear of a municipality that did a dollar matching for matching, right, on for the capitalized value, whatever loss of building value based on the rent reduction. We will match it with we'll share in this cost. I think where developers get frustrated is the idea that if people are hungry, it's because it's the grocery store's fault. We provide housing, we don't obviously control the macro economy, and in fact have no control over how many other people build buildings and therefore how much supply and what the supply and demand imbalance is. So I think Pat's counsel is wise. so that you bring something to the table that is commensurate with, you know, the economics on the ground in your community.
We had a follow-up question with that about density bonuses, about whether they would work in legacy communities.
I'm going to let Pat advise on what a legacy community is.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You mean historical,
I'm
long
not
tenured?
sure. I asked a follow-up about that because I'm not familiar with legacy communities. Maybe I can get a follow-up on that. While we do that, there was another question about conditional rezonings and voluntary commitments for Pat, and whether deed restrictions are placed on that. And also if there's a fee in lieu option for the Todd bonus program.
There's not a fee in lieu option for the Todd bonus program, and we do not do deed restrictions. It's just enforced through the zoning code and the zoning process.
Okay.
We do require in some instances, annual verifications if it's a long-term commitment to affordability. We have our colleagues in our housing program help review the verification of income.
Got it. Okay. And I see that someone did post the applicable housing code a section from the Durham City Code in the chat. So thank you to Jason Lunsford for that.
If I may, I don't know if there's more. There's one thing I'd like to share, and some of it's related to what I've been kind of trying to work with Raleigh on. They've been extremely helpful on it. One of the easiest ways to reduce the cost of housing is reduce the size of the housing. My mom grew up with 4 siblings in a 1,500 square foot house, right? And anything below 2,000 square feet is probably considered inhumane now. But there are lots of ways that you can, again, one of those levers. So when the city says we need there to be a 2-bed, which is affordable to 80% of the median income, is it possible to accomplish that by having a slightly smaller unit? So let me show you what I mean, if I may, just for a moment. So in the case of what I'm working on with Raleigh, a traditional apartment building is set up like this. You have a center loaded corridor, 1 beds, 2 beds, and then you can do what's called co-living on the end, where you're renting by the bedroom and you're sharing a kitchen, and you can absolutely bring the rents down significantly. This is a project in more of a single family typology in Greenville, South Carolina. This is kind of your more typical SRO single family with kitchen living down here and some bedrooms upstairs. So if suddenly everybody's paying $300 per square, 300 square feet, even if the rent is $3 a square feet, that's a very affordable unit. You haven't used any sort of public funds. You've just allowed them to be accommodated in a different sort of space. And, similarly, if you look back, so this is different units that I've found, more historical units. This is a student housing, family housing on Harvard's campus. It's a 3-bedroom unit. I think it's about 850 square feet. Most apartments are designed for single people. If you go rent a 3-bedroom apartment right now, it's going to be 1,300 square feet or 1,400 square feet. You can absolutely reduce the number of square feet in that unit by 500 square feet or more. And in so doing, reduce the rent by $1,000 or more with no financial engineering. These are units that I designed myself. This is a 2-bed with a den. Now, I'm not using these in my day job, but it's a 2-bed with a den for 740 square feet. And this is a 3-bed with 2 baths for 1,000 square feet. Now, I don't know, people, I have myself lived in units at least this smaller, and survived just fine. And so I guess as you guys have influence and you're looking to increase the affordability, in addition to using different forms of subsidy, unit design, I can't overstate the power that you have to create affordable options by simply using more historical proportions in units. If you look at the costs that we've added to buildings and also the size increase in units, it's great, but it can be backbreakingly expensive. And so to the extent that you're desire to have a unit that is affordable at a certain AMI can be paired up with your willingness to have a unit be very slightly smaller, that can go a super long way toward, you know, a solution that doesn't require $1 of public funding, or that you can put public funding in and take a unit like this, and instead of asking for 60% AMI, you ask for 30% AMI because you can get to that level now. It's all about making a cocktail of different solutions as opposed to saying, we're going to solve this problem with one blunt instrument. So anyway, I don't usually have the microphone with a group of people who have the sort of pull that you do. So that's something that I would lobby for.
Okay, well, it's 13 past the hour. We appreciate everyone staying on so long, and we don't have any more questions in the chat, but we first, we again want to thank Ben Stevens and Pat Young for sharing their expertise today. This was very informative, and I think we can agree that there's a lot to know about how to make affordable housing work in market rate developments. But it's hopeful that so many of you joined us today to learn more about it and to explore ways our communities can work together to make it work, make it make sense. So thanks for taking time out of your day to join us. We plan to send a survey to get your input about what other topics you might like to hear about around affordable housing at subsequent roundtables. And we will provide, the information that Pat and Ben provided in the link via email. Thanks to Elisa Glover, who is chairing the zoning, planning, and land use section today, for allowing our subcommittee to do this. And thanks to our subcommittee, Don O'Toole from Durham, who had to leave today, Amy Schaefer in Wilmington, and Janice Ashley in Asheville. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, guys.